Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Tabletopped. This week, we're talking to my good friend Franco about historical settings. Franco runs a game called Argot, and it is based on Roman and Greek culture and history. It's such a cool campaign, and I want to talk to him about how he drew in real-life examples in history to make a fully fledged campaign setting out of. I hope you guys enjoy this one, and if you do, please rate and subscribe to our podcast. It helps a ton. I hope you enjoy this episode. So, Franco, hello.
Hey, what's up?
This is your first time on the podcast, technically, because we recorded our first episode after this. So, who are you? What's your deal?
Oh no, that's what a scary question.
I mean, you can lie to people. No one will be able to call you on it.
That's a good point. Yeah. I'm Franco. I run D&D campaign. I won D&D campaign. I was going to say campaigns, but I'm just running one. And it's my first one, and it's been running for 2 or 3 years at this point.
Yeah.
And I got into D&D maybe like 5 years ago, I think.
Yeah, and you've played in a bunch of campaigns in our friend group as well, and I would say have a pretty good handle on D&D as a whole.
Thank you.
I
try.
The thing about your campaign that I always thought was really interesting is that Argot is basically your interpretation of Greek mythology, right?
Yeah, kind of. It's sort of like I just have an interest in the classical Mediterranean world. I don't know why. It's probably just it's just shit that you get into at certain points of your life. I got really into this podcast called The History of Rome, which is a fairly popular podcast, I think, that came out maybe 10 years ago or something. But it is some that really got me interested in sort of classical history and then Roman history and stuff. And then I thought it would be interesting to set a campaign in the Mediterranean world. And so I just kind of lifted some things from history and just regionally, but I went a little farther back than where most of my interest lies, my amateur historian interest lies, and just went to sort of the ancient Greek era. I guess the analog would be you guys are currently in Argot, which is I guess arguably, it's basically Athens. Again, very amateur historian. I don't know a ton of all of this stuff, and so I don't think a ton of the information that I throw out there is accurate, but I mean it's sort of what you kind of absorb from just learning about certain things. But it's basically ancient Athens, and then there is sort of a Persian Empire analog that is coming from the east, and then a Roman Empire analog that is coming from the west. The heroes are sort of part of this team that lives in this city-state that is sort of close to Athens, and then figure out what to do as both of these powers are sort of encroaching on their doorstep. Yeah.
One of the things that I think is super interesting about it too is that you in your character creation earlier than when I joined the campaign, but everyone is from different places and actually have kind of competing interests in the the main character party, which I think is just a really cool dynamic to have in the game, because it's led to some really weird situations where some characters are kind of trying to do something that's their core directive from their where they're from, what is actually driving them in sort of the grand scheme of things, the overall fate of Argot, but also in the minute to minute, them being in this party and in these situations, that it kind of forces them to make other decisions sometimes too, and those competing desires are really interesting and cool.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about that, and I guess kind of what the comparison might be, is just what something else that kind of interests me about ancient history is just how the politics worked. And I think not intentionally, but maybe just like I was like predisposed to make this happen within the team, is just like, yeah, you all just happen to have like competing interests. One thing that Shade did when he made his character Sora was that he made the character a spy for like the Roman Empire analog for the Wariati Empire. So he's like a spy, and at this point, you guys know this. But spoiler alert for the podcast that will never exist of our campaign. But yeah, his character is just like a spy.
and like Livius is from like a different place that also has sort of
Livius
sort of has
is
his
from
own
Argot.
interests in the political like outcome
No,
of
yeah,
different things.
Yeah, so Livius is from Argot. There are some of like the other characters are like a little bit more, I don't know, like I think it was like kind of just how I set up the world as far as like what people wanted to do, and like people always want to do their own thing, and there's always like a balance between like how much free reign do I give you versus like how much do I want to like concentrate on like what you want the story to be, right?
Yeah. Right.
But like also leaving room, like things that would make sense in the story. Like there's like a lot of things that wouldn't fit as much.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that like the overall kind of theme of this episode is building a campaign setting out of sort of like a historical time and place, and like you said, this is from your kind of interest in the classics, and I've always kind of wanted to ask you, like, where did you start? I think we talked about this a little bit a long time ago, where you kind of told me that you were like really interested in monsters as well, and so you kind of started there. Did you start with like foes and enemies, or did you kind of start like, how did you start building your setting?
Oh yeah, so I think it's hard to remember, to be honest.
Right, it's been a little while.
Yeah, it's hard to remember, and I think the main thing that I wanted was just the idea that there was like these two like encroaching powers, and that you would live in a city state where you would be like something might like these two competing, all of these like political interests are sort of like converging onto this point. But one monster that I was looking at, because like you're right, like I was just looking at a bunch of monsters in the monster manual and like seeing what I was interested by. I found the Rakshasa, and the Rakshasa,
which is a really good one. Yeah.
Yeah, the Rakshasa is a fiend that can turn that can disguise themselves as a humanoid, and so I was like, oh, what if and I mean, this is probably really reflective of like how I made the rest of the campaign as well. It's like, what if their quest giver was also a terrible villain, and they didn't learn that until later. And one thing that was really great, actually, that happened like very early on, because the first, like the intro mission of Argot, which I have still run as like a one shot before, a couple of times, has the Rakshasa character whose name is Hespero, has him sort of like give the characters these like passes to this like island resort. But the island resort is like overrun with like monsters and stuff, and then they have to like break a curse, and then they break a curse, and then I mean, it was kind of silly, and Daniel's character was very much like, I don't want to go on a vacation, I want to go on an adventure. And I'm like, okay, like whatever,
give us a little time.
Yeah, I don't know, like whatever, it's my first time, I don't know what to tell you. Your character has to want to go on this mission.
Right.
I mean, that's like I feel like that's always like the problem with like D&D sometimes, is like, yeah, like you can't just be somebody that doesn't want to go on an adventure.
Yeah, you have to figure out a way to get to yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so so basically, I run it differently now when I run it as a one shot. But yeah, like,
well, what are the differences? Like, did you change it because of that sort of feeling, or did you change it just because as you've gotten to be a more experienced DM, there's just a better way to do it, kind of thing?
No, it's just because Daniel did that, and so I was like, I have to make it so that it's an adventure and not like this like weird contrivance.
Right. Yeah.
It is basically like, because what ends up happening in the mission anyway is that you find this book. And so I was like, okay, well, instead of it being like just something that you might happen to find in the loot, it's, the reason that you're there. And so Hespero sends you to go get his book, but then he's also like, and take these tickets to the resort, because the resort's on the island too, if you want to go. And then the resort's part of it.
Take these coupons to the spa house.
Yeah. If you don't take them, you get turned into a bird. Spoiler alert for my one shot.
So yeah, so that's how it kind of like started. But
yeah. Sorry,
back to your original point. Sorry, I kind of
the...
took us away from it for a second.
No, it's fine. It's fun. And so when Daniel's character gets back, I love that he did this because it was perfect. He like tried to attack Hespero with a spell. And if you know anything about Rakshasas, they can't be affected by spells of 6th level, I want to say, or lower, unless they want to be. And so it's just like, yeah, you shoot a magic missile at him and it just doesn't hit him. He just takes it and he just like cleans his nails or something.
Like a mic drop moment.
Yeah. It's really fun because the Rakshas is a great, quest giver / villain / both. Because they, they're not like they're in the monster manual, their motives aren't necessarily always like
clear.
Yeah, like their motives aren't always clear, and their motives are not necessarily like, I want to take over the world. It's like, sort of like low level shit. And like, Hespero as a character basically, it doesn't give too much away to say like he basically just wants to keep the power that he has, and right now it's at a threat because he is, he basically runs the city state of Argot where the characters all live, and the characters are now sort of aligned in their interests in wanting to keep the evil empire from encroaching on them, basically.
Well, except for maybe Sora.
Well, Sora is working for the other empire.
Yeah, right. It's like, so the interests have collided in a way that still makes it work as a campaign, which has been very fun.
Yeah, and I mean, the things that you guys have seen too is like a lot of that sort of like political machination stuff happens a lot.
So yeah, so you started with the monsters, and it also kind of sounds like you started with like a really clear idea of like what interested you, which is not only this like kind of era of the real world, but also sort of like political dramas and sort of like court politics that also kind of is its own genre in storytelling and fiction. So did you like when you went to marry the two, were you just like, okay, so like this is how this functions, and you just started building out the political workings from like a real world history, or did you kind of diverge there and go into making your kind of fictitious one? Or
yeah, it's a little tricky to say because the original ideas that I had for the Argot campaign weren't it wasn't something that actually like panned out.
Right.
Because at a certain
as
point,
many campaigns end up being.
Yeah, I mean, like, what was your original question exactly?
I guess my original question was like, so you started with this idea of these monsters that are interesting to you, and the kind of court politics that sounds like you were just interested in as a person, like genre wise.
Yeah.
Like, how did you go about like marrying the two? Did you start like building out a political system from like real world history that you had from that time, or did you just sort of make your own fictitious one, or like how did you go about that?
Something that you wouldn't have known because you didn't start with the old group. But so Argot, since it's based on Athens, it's a pure democracy.
Yeah.
Part of that being like everyone who's a citizen can, like basically anybody that can fit in the assembly hall was able to vote on certain things. And there were a few sort of like political things that I had that were really like tied into the story. So there is at one point that there is this like ambassador character that comes from the Mini-OC Empire, which is sort of like the Persian Empire analog, that comes in from that empire. And, they like go to a dinner party where they have like a bunch of ambassadors from all over the world, or, the near world, at Hespero's house, because he's like a big, he's a mover and a shaker, and he basically runs the city. And so he's like, he brings all these ambassadors together, and he tasks the heroes with kidnapping the Mini-OC ambassador. There's another thing too that is kind of important to mention, is that in Argot, magic is illegal. But there is a thriving magical community that lives under Argot.
What made you decide on that decision? Was it just like
I don't know. I think it was probably just like I thought maybe it would be interesting.
Yeah.
and that was kind of it. I don't know if I would do it that way again. I think part of it too is like it's hard to work in magic in a setting sometimes,
especially if you're basing it on real world where it's like, oh, there's no such thing as real magic.
Yeah, like like when we play in the Waterdeep campaign, which is just straight out of the books, right? It's all like they've thought it all out. Like this is how magic works. Like this is how rare it is. And then
there are laws about it.
Yeah, there's like rules, and like if you're a changeling, you have to register yourself, which is like a whole thing. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. I play a changeling in that one, so that's why I think about that all the time. I'm an unregistered changeling. And so yeah, when I was in so basically like the magic being, illegal, Sean's character Livius is a necromancer, so that's really fun. And so yeah, like that's a big part of it, and like the Mini-OC Empire being very pro magic, makes them feel like really well. And so like the sort of like the basis for it being for magic being illegal is that there is this like the sacred center of the city is an anti-magic field. And so based on that, they sort of like culturally like assume that the whole city should be non-magical.
Right. Yeah.
And so like that's part of it, but like it's very understood that magic still goes on, and it happens underground, and it mostly happens because Hespero facilitates it, and he has like his own shop and a casino and stuff. And so there's a lot of like that type of thing where magic being like an underworld thing makes it a little bit even more dangerous than magic normally is.
And it also just makes it kind of fun for the players to have to get out of situations where if they're upstanding citizens, they can't just mind wipe somebody and walk away.
Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, they could. Yeah. I mean, like Livius can't bring in his zombies from his necromancy.
Yeah. That's generally frowned upon.
Well, they'll just fall apart if he takes them into like the city center.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the ambassadors, coming together, the heroes kidnapping the Mini-OC ambassador, and then later on they get taken to court by the Mini-OC ambassador and their lawyer, which is a mind flayer, which was really fun to just like have a mind flayer in there as a lawyer. And like it was really funny because I think they were like slightly too low level to be fighting a mind flayer. But I was like, no, I just want a mind flayer here because I think it'd be good. It's scary, like they want to eat your brain, but it's like
lawyers are scary.
And lawyers are scary. Yeah, I mean it was very much like you're not gonna have to fight him. Like don't worry about it. But they didn't know that. Yeah, exactly. No, they never had to fight him, and I never like set up an encounter for it either. Like I never like planned an encounter for it either. But yeah, so like a lot of the political stuff was sort of based on around that, like sort of court drama was like, and then part of that too was like trying to get the heroes to get like political positions so that they could be immune from prosecution, which is like
just funny in general.
Yeah, like it's a thing that like when I came up with it, it wasn't like in the current events as much.
Yeah, right.
Like when I came up with that idea of like, oh, it would be interesting if like the heroes could get like, prosecutorial immunity because they are serving in office, which is like a thing that a lot of countries have and have had for a long time.
Yeah,
like that's one of the main reasons why Julius Caesar didn't want to give up his army in Gaul. Like him crossing the Rubicon with a Roman army, like a standing Roman army, like was illegal.
Right.
But him giving up that army would have meant that he would have like been completely out of power and open to all of the lawsuits that were waiting for him. Like that was like the main thing.
It's just like super interesting that like, because as someone who's not super steeped in Greek mythology, at least like not like I'm more interested in the myth side of Greek history and everything.
Yeah.
But the actual history stuff is just as interesting and just as like you can research as much as you want on that and keep finding new stuff. And it's so interesting to me where I'm like, oh yeah, like I've always had this kind of like atmospheric feeling of where all of this stuff comes from in the game. Like, it feels right, but like I had no idea about all of that, and that's like having that be the reasoning behind that stuff that happened before I came in is just like very interesting and funny to me. That's like all still based out of real life stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. I just find so many of those things interesting. Like, there's like a little thing that is kind of coming up, and it's like just like a little line, like a thing that I wrote that is based on a real thing that the Roman Empire did. Basically, they sent an ambassador to a king. It was something like they were like, hey, you need to give us an answer about something, like I think maybe like paying tribute to us or something like that, or like submitting to us or something.
As
like
they
some
did,
like
yeah.
yeah, like some minor king, and they just sent out an ambassador. And the thing about the Roman Empire is that, like, well, I think this was even the Republican era, like before the emperors. And so the thing about the Roman Empire that is like very wild is that like they were also devoted to this concept of like being a Roman citizen and being a Roman.
Yeah.
And so like every single individual Roman citizen that was like of a certain class, obviously like an equestrian or senator class,
Yeah.
was very important, and more important than like a literal king of an entire country.
Right.
And so like an ambassador going up to a king and just saying like, okay, have your answer for me before you step out of this circle. Like him just like, he basically what they do is
And you're
like,
saying that to the king of this country.
Yeah, like an ambassador like going up to you and just saying like, I need your answer right now, and the king saying like, oh, well, I'll have to think about it or whatever. And then the guy just draws a circle in the sand around him, and he says, have an answer for me before you step out of that circle. It's just like, it's completely insane.
It's wild. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, there's so many like little like interesting, things like that. I remember there's another like interesting story where like Hannibal, who like was defeated by the Romans ultimately, but like he basically ran all over Italy, like conquering a bunch of people and like destroying Roman armies. He just like has dinner one time like with the guy who defeated him like years later, and they're just like having dinner, and it's like a really funny thing that happened. Like they just like are hanging out.
Yeah, right. There's not
like
the
these
sort of like long
two, like,
lasting
famous
enmity.
generals. Yeah, like there's so many like little moments like that in history that are just kind of interesting to me. And like honestly, I don't really know a ton about Greek mythology or even Roman mythology. I mean, I know like what I read like in school,
Right. Yeah.
like in college and stuff, because I took like some like English lit classes that sort of drew on the classics a lot, and so you'd have to read some of the classics first.
Yeah.
But a lot of those didn't super inform what I did.
Yeah. It kind of sounds like if somebody was to look to make their own setting out of a specific time period or a certain kind of like place in the real world, it kind of sounds like, from what I've gathered from you just in this conversation, that a really valuable thing to do would be to pick out the stories that from that culture, from that time period, that are like super interesting and stick in your mind and be like, okay, this is like the feel that I'm going for. Is that what you like? Would you suggest that as well, or do you think that that's sort of off base, that you should start with more like a technical thing?
I mean, it's always hard to like adapt things, and I think it's especially hard to adapt it into a media like a medium like a role-playing game,
where it's kind of all variables.
Yeah, there's like you just want to introduce as many interesting variables as possible.
Yeah.
Right. Like me trying to sort of like introduce this sort of like political plot or whatever, and it was just kind of like, okay, like maybe this is gonna work, and I don't know if it was 100% successful or if I would do it that way again, but like just trying to see like what people would do with that, like trying to see like what decisions people would make, like presenting, like thinking of like interesting moments in history where there was sort of like a decision point where something could have happened one way or another, like is an interesting way of thinking about like big historical events.
Right.
So yeah, that's one way you could do it, I think, is like just thinking of like really interesting historical moments and seeing like, but like finding ones that are very like choice oriented, or there's like a divergence.
That's like a really cool way to think about it, of like not reducing, but like looking at a time period and finding the decision points that kind of altered where things went and how things kind of worked around them is like a really cool way of sort of seeing how, you know, consequence could be played out within your campaign as well, because you can kind of find different examples of different things happening and being like, okay, so this is sort of the general vibe that would happen if somebody killed an ambassador or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like somebody, like a powerful figure asks you to kidnap an ambassador because they're stealing bodies and making I mean, there's like a lot of like stuff that happened, I mean, I know that's not related to the history stuff, but that's all like stuff that I took from books too.
Right.
Like I find a lot of inspiration from like different sources, obviously. The Deathless One and the Ambassador were basically based on this book series by Anne Leckie. Ancillary Justice is the first book in the series, and the main villain, you know, is like a multi-bodied person who like just has you know, has a singular consciousness but is like in a bunch of bodies, like a hive mind, right, basically. Yeah. And so, which is terrifying.
Just as a concept in general, hive minds are never, you know, a positive.
Yeah. But you know, but like I feel like most mind hives in fiction are very like unintelligent, but like having like an intelligent hive-minded person with like, you know, with like agency and like doing things and like kind of just sending their body out to do anything is like completely terrifying.
And that's a good point too, of
like
being able to blend these things of the stuff that you're interested in that are, you know, complete and total fiction with a setting that is based off of a real place is like very important too, because I mean, unless you want a campaign that is truly just like, hey, we're Romans in the Roman Empire, then you can totally do that as well. But I like the idea that you're like kind of picking the stuff that interests you from fiction and then incorporating that into the setting that you've built as well, to kind of make it still feel like unique and fresh and interesting.
Yeah. One thing that I realized actually as we were just talking is that so there's a portion of the campaign, which is where you joined, called the 13 Islands, where I basically wanted to use as many monsters as possible, and just put them into like a little like region of 13 islands for you guys to wander around. You're sent off into this demi-plane and then you're like sort of lost. That's sort of like the Odyssey.
Yeah, no, for sure. I actually thought that was your intention by that.
No, it wasn't. It was an accident.
Yeah, there's like the way that things come up and like the types of monsters that we face. I was like, yeah, this is definitely a nod to the Odyssey.
Yeah, I've never read it. I don't know anything about
That's very funny.
No, I read Ulysses though in school. It's not a great it's not a great time. I'm sure the Odyssey's more fun as like a reading experience.
Yeah. Well, Ulysses is like more it's contemporary, right? It's not even set during that time period. Are you mean the Iliad or?
Yeah. No. Ulysses is a book by James Joyce.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's like I think it's set in the 20s, but I don't think it was written in the 20s. Right. I think it was written in like the 40s or something. Mm-hmm. I don't recommend reading it. This is the section of the podcast where we recommend to not read certain things.
Yeah, this is the anti-recommendation zone.
Yeah. I don't think it would be an unpopular thing to say that it's hard to read and I don't recommend it.
Well, there's also,
I think most people that have read, it's not like a huge fan favorite.
Yeah, right. There's also, so you're like, not to blow up your spot as you're still in development, but you have kind of talked to me about wanting to, I think it was like either English or like Viking mythology, and making a Powered by the Apocalypse game out of like a setting from that kind of mythology. Is that something you're still interested in? And like, can you tell me a little bit about how you're going about that now after doing kind of something similar with Argot?
Yeah, I haven't been looking. Well, so I haven't been. I mean, I guess I have been working on and off on it. But there is like, and I'm kind of like taking from a bunch of different things. but I've gotten really into witchcraft recently.
Sure. Yeah.
For reasons I won't divulge here. To not dox myself.
Yeah.
But which I just did. Just gotten really into witchcraft. I find it really interesting. Obviously, witchcraft trials, very tragic events and stuff. And I'm also interested in religion and like gods and stuff. And I know like all of that stuff that I just said is like a huge bummer for some people. But I think it's like interesting to explore. And I don't know. I mean like certainly in, certain spaces, like you can do that in a way that isn't like traumatizing or, unpleasant.
Yeah, right.
But like I was looking at sort of witchcraft as a practice and as like something that is, more based in basically like not what the people who did the Inquisition and stuff thought witchcraft was, like what people kind of do witchcraft as now, which is more like herbalism and like, divination, but also sort of like, I feel like it's like kind of meditative as well, certain things like that. I would say I'm into researching witchcraft right now. I haven't actually started practicing it at all.
Right. Yeah.
It's I did sort of look into like, can you be an atheist and a witch? And it's like, yeah, totally. And so I was also like looking into religion, and there's another book by Anne Leckie that I also read called The Raven Tower, which is a great book. I won't spoil what it's kind of based on because it sort of spoils it a little bit. But the main thing that I found really fascinating was like the main character is a god, like a really ancient god. And so I found the way that sort of worked, like the rules of the gods that sort of are set up in that book, I found really fascinating. Like basically like how, gods have to like expend power to, make something true. Like everything that a god says has to be true.
Right.
And if it's not true, they expend some of their power to make it true.
Ooh, that's really interesting. I love that.
Yeah. And so
I'm using that.
So if a god isn't, I'm stealing the shit out of that.
Yeah, exactly.
And if a god isn't powerful enough, they will die. Like that's how you kill a god, is by making it say something that is impossible.
Yeah.
I forget one god made like an object that was like a spear that would always hit the person that it was, it would always kill the person that it was thrown at. But the god was like careful by saying like, oh, it can only be thrown by the person named like this name or whatever, by whatever, Tim or whatever. And
God, Tim has the spear. Everyone get the fuck away.
But the problem was like the god wasn't specific enough. So every descendant of the first Tim was also named Tim, and they could also use the spear. And the god was like, this is not a good idea. Send it back to me. And the person threw the spear at the god and killed him.
It's literally proving our point that lawyers truly are the people to be feared.
Very true. Good point. I think, and that is sort of like a side story as well. That's not like a main plot story. So it's not like a huge spoiler.
Right,
It's sort of just like a story that god tells to explain the concept of like, hey, this is, this is dangerous. But yeah, some of the other things, just like Anglo-Saxon invasions and stuff. I was watching like the Last Kingdom, which is about like the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and like the first Danish invasions and stuff.
Yeah.
Just pretty interesting. Just in terms of like how all of these cultures are sort of like butting up against each other. And so like that's what I was kind of writing a campaign around, was like religion and like magic, but also like cultures like bumping into each other.
Yeah. I think that's super interesting because like the amount of research you do is something that I find very interesting, even though it's sort of stuff you're interested in anyway. So you're kind of acquiring knowledge that you are interested in. It's not like a labor, but I remember in Lakewood, which was also based off sort of like a real time and a real place, which was my Powered by the Apocalypse Monster of the Week game. And you would catch me all the time when I would be like, yeah, this is happening in this time period. And then you'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about? That doesn't happen until like the early 2000s or whatever. And so like I definitely think that it is important that if you are going to really try to like set something in a real world, especially if it's some within your player's real life memory that you have to kind of have your shit together when it comes to that stuff.
Yeah, that was all really funny to me because it was very much just like, it's like, I don't know, I guess I was paying slightly more attention in like the 90s and 2000s that I knew that this didn't happen
Yeah,
in the 80s.
exactly. And then like I was, I after like the second time I got caught, I was like, well, this is a different, and I kind of leaned into the multiverse thing, and I was like, this is kind of a different Earth than the one that we're familiar with. So then this Earth, it kind of happened a little bit earlier.
All the stuff was so insignificant too.
Yeah.
Like literally everything was like, obviously it would have been insignificant. It wasn't like, oh, 9/11 happened.
Yeah,
It's like,
exactly.
well, but that was not in the 80s though, Nick.
Yeah, exactly.
But it would be like, when was the premiere of Frasier?
Yeah.
You
which
and like,
honestly became pretty important to a campaign by the
yeah,
end.
it was a major plot point. My character was a huge Frasier fan from Cheers.
Yeah, I think that's also something to mention, is that when you're setting something up in a real world, if you start to get the feeling that one of your players has a deep interest in knowledge in a specific part of that history, that you should probably learn up about it so that you can, talk the talk with them while it happens, because otherwise it does kind of, I feel like, serves as a way for the mood to kind of break if you're constantly being like, oh, I didn't know that, or that doesn't happen or whatever. But if you can actually talk with your player on the level of their interest, especially if you share a time period of interest, that's like can really give you some easy points in running a campaign.
Yeah, I guess for me in that time period, I guess that was like TV and movies, I guess.
Yeah,
probably.
right. And some literature,
Right? Like, I think
I remember Shade had a whole list of bestsellers that came out in like all like the late 80s, early 90s, because he ran a bookstore.
Right, yeah, because of the bookstore. Oh, one thing that is interesting actually about that I don't know if you've ever thought about, but Shade literally studied like like Near Eastern and archaeology. So like me putting together this game, like I think at some point I was kind of like, I better know my shit, I guess, because he could just. It's like, oh shit, this guy really studied this stuff.
Yeah, he like I feel like Shade's pretty good, but he also can drop a huge amount of knowledge on certain subjects.
Oh yeah, no, the man knows a lot of things.
Yeah. So if you were to recommend, like someone's like wants to get into running campaigns, doing all the stuff that we like to do, and they want desperately to base it out of a real life time, or if they are just trying to get like the feel and they're trying to kind of merge, high fantasy or some other genre with a real place that they're interested in, how would you recommend they sort of go about it? Some advice, some things that you kind of fucked up with that you would recommend people kind of avoid and stuff like that.
I think one thing I would say, and I think this isn't really something that we've talked about, but I think it's really important to be cautious when you're like, I don't know, plundering cultures.
Oh, dude, yeah. Like I was thinking about that too, because this isn't like a D&D specific podcast, but I was reading a really interesting article about D&D, about how even like down in its DNA, like big monsters like the Tarrasque and like Lich's phylacteries and stuff are all just kind of like appropriated from different cultures, and it's like it's kind of a weird feeling to be like, yeah, it has this other meaning in this fantasy setting, but also like the real world person who made this game just sort of kind of, like you said, culturally plundered a bunch of different things.
Oh yeah, like the Rakshasa is literally from Indian mythology.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm trying to think of like a lot of other monsters that have that. There's a ton of
like
them,
golems.
like all over
I mean,
D&D,
there's a lot of.
Golems.
Just
Yeah,
tons of stuff in there, and it is interesting. Like I would also agree with that to be. I don't know, like, don't be careful, but be like respectful. And if you're like taking things from a different culture, then definitely, don't be like, oh, this weird spice trade thing happening here, and they're all evil merchants or whatever.
Yeah, right. Like, well, I mean, I think that's also something that can be really easy to fall into with D&D, or with anything that is sort of like role playing or I don't know, fiction or anything in the world or whatever, is like just dehumanization and like othering people and stuff like that. Yeah. And I was talking about like the Mini-OC Empire, and obviously it's sort of like they're mostly just based on the Persian Empire because they are in the eastern part, and I was basing the Roman Empire just because it was coming from the west, and I was like, yeah, this is kind of similar, but like almost not at all.
Yeah, right.
But like, you know, and like trying to like not like paint it in this like weird, like highly racist way, or just that's saying
usually
like,
a good thing to avoid.
Yeah, it's just kind of like, this is what the map looks like. This is based on Athenian, you know, sort of stuff, and then these are the two empires that are sort of competing over this space. Is basically what it was based on. Obviously, like imperialism is a really, you know, hard topic to, you know, it's very like commodified in a lot of like spaces, like in a lot of like games and stuff like that,
especially in like sci-fi and stuff, like anything to do with like space travel and colonization in that way is also very, you know, hard to kind of hard to parse sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, like a lot of the things that I do in, you know, and I think something that's important to do when you're doing like historical adaptations, I guess, is like to think about how everybody involved is being affected by what's happening. Yeah. Because there's this thing in history that it's like the great man theory, which just like, oh yeah, like, you know, Winston Churchill did like this or whatever. And by the way, Winston Churchill, you know, was a terrible person. I don't know how many people know about that.
No, I mean, like the dude had like some, you know, political savvy and some military brilliance in some ways, but he was a fucking crazed like alcoholic.
Well, I mean, he was also like a genocidal asshole.
Yeah. I mean, you know, that era was kind of full of them too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was just like the big era of like great men, quote unquote, like doing all this terrible shit. Yeah. And like the only reason that we, you know, kind of think of them in that way of like, oh, these great men who did all these terrible things is, you know, like compared to say like Julius Caesar. It's like, oh, Julius Caesar and like Caesar Augustus and like all these great emperors. And it's like, no, these are all like megalomaniacal jerks.
Yeah, and like a lot of them took, you know, the first democracies that we had, you know, Western style democracies, and then just crushed it underneath their authoritarian boot heel. So,
well, I mean, to also be fair, like the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic before the empire was like set up to be like an oligarchy, you know, controlled by all the senators, and like there's like a whole group of people that they were just like, you're not allowed to do this. Like, are you crazy? Like, no.
Luckily that we've like, moved beyond that. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Yeah, there's I don't know, it's just interesting to look at history and like try to think of it from like different perspectives, like the people who are actually living day to day. Like that was the most interesting part for me, like when doing some research. Like I read this book called like A Day in the Life of like a Roman Citizen or something like that, and it would take you like hour by hour through like what it was like to live in, you know, ancient Rome, like in the city.
Oh, that's actually really cool. I might borrow that book.
I don't have it. I read it at my friend's house. Oh, gotcha. It's a really good book. But it is I want to say the language that the guy uses sometimes is a little bit like outdated.
Yeah, sure.
When he talks about like people in certain ways. Yeah. And it's like, why are you talking about it like this? Whatever. That was one of the places where I learned about like Roman apartment buildings.
Excuse me?
I mean, that's something that we
they
did.
had apartment buildings?
Oh yeah, of course.
That's amazing.
You can't imagine that. Yeah, they had apartment buildings. And usually it was like the ground floor was usually shops, but it was also sometimes like estates. Right. Like the richest people would live on the ground floor, and then the poorest people would live, so like the poorest people that were legally living in the building would live on the top floor, because, you know,
they had to climb.
You have to climb all the stairs. Yeah. And then even poorer than that were people who lived like on top of that. And so like that's why Rome had so many fires, you know, is like you would just have like people living on top, like they would just start building like, you know, wooden structures on top of the building to like create more floors and stuff, or like more housing and stuff for the people. And like you'd have like two or three families living per apartment, you know, and so I guess, you know, not much different than the world is now. Yeah. But it's just like these things are like, you know,
kind of like rooftop like shanty town type things.
Yeah, like yeah, exactly. It would be like just a vertical shanty towns.
Yeah, right.
Is basically what these were. It's like it's terrible. I mean, like a lot of a lot of what we think are terrible things today is like still shit that happened all those years ago.
Yeah.
Like,
and actually, I think that you've done a really good job in the campaign and actually has caused some inter-party tension sometimes, but the way you, I think, very successfully are able to sort of, I don't know, keep this, like, to leave your kind of opinions or, like, our real-world cultural prejudice and stuff out of the game is that you always present all of the sides of a situation very neutrally as like all of these people could be correct and like whatever you as a party decide to do is going to have consequences both good and bad on either side. So it's really about the players making decisions within the game and then like dealing with those decisions rather than sort of this culture's attitude is like morally reprehensible and we're going to put our sort of opinion hats on and be able to judge them. Like, I don't think I've ever felt comfortable making a judgment about any like different place that we visited within the game because most of the time there is like such intricacies within the dynamics between the people that I mean, to be fair, usually ends up with us committing a horrible act and being like, oh my God, how did this happen? I think that's like a really like, that is a really interesting thing that you brought up as like a pitfall. And like, I think you've done a really good job at kind of skirting it through doing that kind of in the way you present your NPCs.
Yeah, that made me think of when you guys went to like that, the goat village or not the goat village.
The goat god.
Yeah, there's a monster. I think they're called yak folk, which are also almost certainly based on like some cultures, like like there is like there's some creature that is like some cryptid or something that's like similar to this that was just lifted for D&D. Yeah. But they sort of like they kind of do like body snatching, and then you guys like drove them out, like the actual yak folk. And then like the villagers were left behind, and then you guys were like, "Oh, okay, you guys can stop doing human sacrifices now." And they were like, "Oh no, that we always did human sacrifices. That's like our whole bag. We just didn't do it as frequently as they were making us do it."
Right. Yeah.
And then you guys kind of just like backed away.
Yeah. And it was also like there was a moment where there was like this demon that was in captivity and was powering this floating castle and essentially
floating island.
A floating island, yeah. And
yeah.
You basically set it up as this demon was like, yeah, I'd really appreciate it if you let me out and like I'll help you out. This is like a contractual promise that I will help you no matter what. And then we were like, oh, that sounds really good. And then other people were like, yeah, but it's a demon and it's gonna, and like bringing their own kind of feelings into it. And we're like, yeah, it's better to just kill it here. And then we killed the demon. It stopped powering the floating island and it just crashed into the water, like killing many of the civilians aboard the island. So it's just like, you've kind of hoisted us by our own petard in that situation.
Yeah, that was really fun.
So yeah, other than the cultural traps that you can fall into, is there any other things, either good or bad, that you would give advice to someone who's adapting a setting?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think like just doing some research and like finding out how people used to live can be really interesting. Like just saying like, oh, this is like people. There's like so many ways to live, like or like we only think of like, like people back in the day like living in like stone buildings or like wooden buildings or whatever, but it's like you can make houses out of mud brick.
Yeah, right.
There's like a lot. I think I mentioned like mud brick structures a couple times in Argot. Certainly I do in like my fiction and stuff, where it's just like, yeah, like mud brick is a really good building tool.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is not really D&D related, but I fell down a YouTube hole the other day about cob houses. Have you seen these videos? It's basically someone building an entire house for like $10,000, $20,000 out of what is essentially cob, which is kind of like a hay-like substance that is then surrounded by mud and clay, and they build a full house out of it.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's just really interesting to learn about how other people, and even just like creating different cultures out of it and just thinking like, okay, what would be really important to this group of people because they live in this certain way? You can create a whole culture from that. Like just based on like where people live or how they live or what technology they have access to, or happen to develop, or even like magic that they happen to have as well.
Yeah.
Like there's all, or like there's one campaign that I'm in where there's like a big like elemental power is very important. So like elemental things are very coveted.
Yeah.
So like if you had like an elemental like fire thing, you could use it to like light your stove like forever.
Yeah.
Like you would just have it, and it would be very rare and hard to come by, and usually people become very wealthy by exploiting that.
Yeah.
So
it's,
I think that's
I think it's also really interesting if you have something that you are employing in your campaign. Like you said, in Argot, they have worshipped this sort of anti-magic field in the center of town. If this is true, what else is true? Well, they probably don't like the use of magic. If they think that spot is kind of holy and divine or whatever, then they're probably not super into the use of magic.
Right, yeah. I think learning about, I think another thing that is helpful is just like learning about like historical events or like, certain things like, I don't know, I'm trying to think like the French Revolution has a bunch of like really wild stuff that happened during it. There's like two defenestrations of Prague that happened. I don't really know anything about them. I just know that a bunch of people were thrown out of a window twice. It sounds very funny, but obviously some of those people died.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not great.
It's also interesting to kind of look at how things were used, because like with historical perspective can come a little bit of neutrality, like when it comes to in the French Revolution, the like let them eat cake sort of thing. It's like, oh, she actually never said that, but that was used as like a political tool by the revolutionaries to kind of gin up support. And so you can take that idea of, oh, we can use the discontent or misinformation of a group because information spread is limited to like power, political revolution and stuff, and then you can put that into your campaign, but have it basically be from the different things that you see really are remembered throughout history and things like that.
That's an interesting way of thinking about this question too. Yeah. Like just like, how history is controlled, how information is controlled.
Yeah.
Like that can also be a fun thing to like include in I was thinking too, there's the portion that you all are in the campaign or just escaped from, the 13 Islands. So much of that is about this demiplane that was like locked 600 years ago. And so like all of the people on these islands are living with the repercussions of, being locked away for 600 years, and like all of the histories and like the war and like the trauma that they all had to undergo.
It was
like,
also really
this,
cool.
like, this like generational trauma.
Yeah, exactly. And like I wasn't there for the campaign beforehand, but I also sort of got to witness some of the other characters that were sort of piece some information together based on like what history these people that have been locked in this plane and have allowed certain facts to kind of germinate and continue on, wherein like the outer plane they had been like heavily controlled or altered to maintain kind of power by Hespero and stuff. It's like kind of interesting that you were able to sort of in the lore sort of develop and make more complicated the character's understanding of the world by kind of offering this alternate view of history.
Yeah, I think a lot of D&D modules do this too. I know they sort of have things set up where like, oh, this character actually believes this and that's not true.
Yeah.
Or like I find that really interesting, like this, because like part of D&D is sort of cobbling together information and facts and trying to figure out like what is the best decision here.
Yeah. And
like if you don't have all of the facts, then you might make some decision that you wouldn't have made if you had all the facts.
I think that's like, also really interesting of like character motivation also being around information and like whether or not they are correct is like a really interesting way of thinking about it. Well, thank you so much, Franco. I thought that this was a really cool talk just about, I mean, even if people don't even think about TTRPGs in this way. This is just an interesting talk about history and its sort of its study, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for talking to me about it.
And I'm sure that I want to get you on again so that we can talk. I mean, when people talk about TTRPGs, generally they usually think D&D, but I think both you and I have been, especially recently, more and more fascinated with other systems and how they do things and everything. Like, we eventually come back to D&D to play with the main groups, but I know that we've had some really cool conversations about different systems and how they run. So I definitely want to talk about that with you too.
Yeah, I haven't even run any of those games either, so I'm interested in.
What about the Magical Schoolgirl one that you ran?
Oh yeah.
Which was hilarious. I've only heard about it secondhand, but I've only heard good things.
It was very silly.
Yeah.
But it was fun. But I think it was like, it's really funny to like cobble together on the fly a game system just based on like there's like a schoolgirl RPG book
that
I picked up that Rebecca, my wife, insisted that we get from from the game store, from Pandemonium, I think.
Yeah.
And she was like, I want to play this. I'm like, oh, you never want to play games. Okay, let's do it. And then I was like reading through the rules and I was like, there's like multiplication in this. I'm going to try to find a simpler way of playing this game.
Yeah, exactly. How can I do this without doing math that, a teenager has to learn?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like you don't want to do, like, every time you do something, you don't want to multiply. You want to add.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's faster.
Well, thanks again, and we'll have you on soon. Anything you want to leave the audience with?
No.
Okay, great. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, listen to the podcast again.
All right, bye.
Bye.
There it is, everyone. Another episode of Tabletopped. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Franco. You're going to be hearing from him a lot soon as we talk in more depth about some other topics, including map making. And if you have any topics that you are really interested in hearing about, please let us know. You can send us an email at tabletoppodcast@gmail.com or DM us or add a comment to any of our posts on our Twitter account @Tabletopped. We will definitely read everything you guys send, and hopefully you'll hear some of your suggestions in some future shows. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you soon.